Shaq was just passing by when he saw it. A decorated war veteran, shoved against a cop car like a common criminal. His Purple Heart medal glinted under the streetlights, but Officer Brady just laughed. "Heroes don't steal," he sneered. The crowd watched in silence. Cameras rolled. But Shaq? He stepped forward, towering over the scene. Because what he did next wouldn't just clear an innocent man's name. It would expose corruption, humiliate a dirty cop, and change everything. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you stunned. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq didn't need to say another word. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows as the crowd grew. Phones were out, cameras rolling, but no one dared to step in, except him. Officer Brady, a stocky man with a thick mustache and an ego to match, turned slowly, his smirk fading the moment his eyes traveled up to meet Shaq's. His bravado wavered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. "And who the hell are you?" Brady sneered, gripping Frank's arm tighter. Shaq ignored the question. Instead, he glanced down at the trembling man against the police car. Frank's thin frame was barely able to withstand Brady's grip. His military jacket was faded but neatly pressed, and his Purple Heart medal still shone despite the rough handling. Shaq's jaw tightened. "Let him go," Shaq said, his voice deep and steady. Brady chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't give orders here, big guy. This old man is a thief." Frank, still gasping from the rough treatment, shook his head desperately. "I was going to pay. I swear. I just needed a second to grab the money from my pocket." Shaq turned his gaze toward the store. Inside, the young cashier looked pale, his fingers twitching on the counter. His eyes darted between Brady and Shaq, his lips pressed tightly together. Something wasn't right. Shaq could smell it. He stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over Brady. "You sure about that, officer?" Brady's smirk returned, though this time it was thinner, weaker. "You don't know how things work, do you? We get a report, we act on it. That's how the law works." Shaq folded his arms. "Law? Or just an excuse to throw your weight around?" Brady's nostrils flared. "Back off before you find yourself in cuffs, too." Frank winced as Brady yanked his arms again, the old man's breath hitching. The sound did something to Shaq, like a trigger being pulled. His fingers twitched, his body tensed, but he forced himself to stay calm. Instead, he turned back to the crowd. "Y'all recording this?" A few heads nodded. Someone whispered, "It's live." Brady stiffened, his grip faltering. Shaq noticed it instantly. He took another step closer. "See, officer, people like you love power. But the second that power is questioned, you panic." Brady's eyes flickered with something dangerous, humiliation, anger. A man like him wasn't used to being challenged. The cashier inside swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now. Shaq narrowed his eyes. "You look nervous, kid. Want to tell the truth before this gets worse?" Brady snapped his head toward the store. "Stay out of it, Shaq," he growled. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "So you do know who I am?" Brady's jaw tightened. The crowd murmured. Shaq felt the shift, the control slipping from the officer's hands. But before he could push further, Brady did something reckless. He pulled Frank away from the car and yanked out his radio. "I've got a situation here. Need backup." Shaq's eyes darkened. "Yeah," he muttered. "You're gonna need it." The air was thick with tension. The crowd had stopped murmuring, their breaths held as if even the smallest sound would set something off. Phones were out, cameras rolling. This was no longer just a minor police stop. This was a moment. Brady's smirk twitched as Shaq took another step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over the officer. The badge on Brady's chest gleamed under the streetlights, but the confidence in his stance was slipping. He puffed out his chest, masking his unease. "And who the hell are you?" Brady sneered, voice laced with mockery. Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was enough. Behind Brady, Frank let out a shaky breath. His weary eyes met Shaq's, silently pleading. His wrists were red, the cuffs digging too tight against thin, wrinkled skin. Shaq turned his attention to the store clerk behind the counter. The young man was gripping the register so hard his knuckles had turned white. His eyes darted between Brady and Shaq, panic flickering across his face. Shaq's voice was calm but firm. "Did he really steal something?" The store clerk swallowed hard. Shaq took another step closer. Look me in the eyes and say it. The clerk hesitated. The doubt was written all over his face. Brady noticed it too. His grip on Frank tightened. You think you can intimidate me? He spat. This old man is coming to jail. Shaq's hands curled into fists. He had dealt with men like Brady before. Power-hungry, full of ego, never willing to admit when they were wrong. But what made it worse was the way Brady looked at Frank. Not as a man, not as a veteran who had served his country, but as an inconvenience. Frank winced as Brady yanked his cuffs tighter. Shaq's voice dropped, ice cold. You want to try that again? Brady's breath hitched. Just for a second. The crowd leaned in. Someone whispered, "Oh, he messed up." Brady knew he had lost control of the situation. His grip loosened, just a fraction, but enough for Shaq to notice. Enough for the crowd to notice. Brady suddenly realized he just made a big mistake. A police siren blared in the distance. Backup was on the way. But for who? The tension hung thick in the air, heavier than before. Officer Daniels, the younger cop standing slightly behind Brady, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched near his belt, not in aggression, but hesitation. He wasn't expecting things to escalate this far. Brady, on the other hand, looked completely at ease. Too at ease. He smirked as if this was routine, as if he had played this game before and always won. Shaq, however, wasn't someone you played games with. Frank, still cuffed, took a shaky breath. I just wanted to pay for my food. I had the money, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq didn't take his eyes off the store clerk. Tell them the truth. The clerk's face paled, his throat bobbing as he swallowed nervously. His hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He looked at Brady, then at Shaq, then at Frank, who was trembling. Daniels caught this too. His jaw clenched slightly. Something wasn't right. Brady, of course, didn't care. He let out a condescending laugh. Doesn't matter. We have probable cause. Shaq's eyes darkened as he took a step forward, his presence looming over Brady. Probable cause? His voice was low, sharp. Or just probable racism? The words sliced through the air like a knife. The crowd murmured. Some gasped. And Daniels flinched. Because deep down, he knew Shaq might be right. A bead of sweat rolled down Daniels' temple. For the first time, he questioned if he was on the right side of this. The moment Shaq spoke, the weight of his words pressed down on the small convenience store. The crowd had grown bigger, and now all eyes were on the nervous young cashier. The tension in the air was thick, nearly suffocating. Shaq didn't blink, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Say it. The cashier looked at Brady, then at Shaq, then at Frank, who stood trembling in the too tight handcuffs. His lips parted, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his throat visibly bobbing. Brady's eyes narrowed dangerously. Don't even think about it, he muttered under his breath, barely audible to anyone but the clerk. Shaq caught it. The cashier's fingers twitched as he gripped the counter. He exhaled sharply, then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I made a mistake. The words shattered the tense silence like glass hitting the pavement. Brady's head snapped toward him. His nostrils flared, his grip on Frank tightening as if the old man was somehow responsible for the sudden shift in power. What did you just say? His voice was dangerously low. The murmurs in the crowd swelled into full conversations. People exchanged glances, whispering about what this could mean. Shaq crossed his arms over his chest, his towering frame making Brady look smaller than ever. His tone was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. You're lying about this, aren't you? The cashier hesitated, shifting from foot to foot like a man deciding whether to step off a ledge. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he gave a slow, reluctant nod. Officer Daniels stiffened, his hand hovering near his radio. Realization dawned in his eyes. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was corruption, plain and simple. Brady's face twisted into something ugly. His jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed on his forehead. He wasn't expecting this. He had been so sure the lie would hold. Shaq's smirk was slow and deliberate. Now, officer, he said, his voice dripping with quiet authority. What were you saying about probable cause? Brady's fingers twitched near his baton because he knew he was losing control. And when a man like him loses control, that's when he's the most dangerous. Brady's jaw tightened, his grip on his baton rigid as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The air around them was thick, the crowd growing more restless by the second. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs turned to quiet outrage. But Brady, He wasn't about to back down. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside him, the weight of the situation finally settling in. Could feel the eyes on them, the dozens of cameras capturing every movement. This wasn't just another routine stop gone wrong. This was turning into something much bigger. But Brady, he didn't care. His lip curled as he looked back at Frank, still in cuffs, still wearing his old military jacket, his Purple Heart medal glinting under the streetlights. "I don't need that idiot cashier's word," Brady spat. His voice was louder now, his anger barely contained. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. "This old man is a criminal." Frank let out a slow breath. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, his body language that of a man who had seen far worse things in his time, but still wasn't used to being treated this way. "Why would I steal," he said, voice steady but weary, "when I have my military pension?" The crowd murmured louder. Shaq, still towering over Brady with his arms crossed, let the silence stretch. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't backing down. He was letting Brady dig his own grave. Finally, he spoke, his voice smooth and razor sharp. "That's a good question, officer." Brady's eyes twitched, just for a second, just enough for Shaq to see the crack in his armor. But then the arrogance returned, the sneer, the puffed-out chest, the way he squared his shoulders, trying to make himself seem bigger, meaner, tougher. "You think you're untouchable?" Brady growled, stepping in closer, his face inches from Shaq's. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the weak attempt at intimidation. Brady clenched his jaw so hard it looked like it might snap. The veins in his neck bulged. His fingers twitched, still gripping the baton at his side. His breathing was coming heavier now. And then, his hand shot down to his belt. The movement was fast, too fast. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed. Daniels instinctively reached forward as if to stop him, but Shaq moved first. Brady's chest rose and fell in sharp, angry breaths, but he wasn't fooling anyone. His grip on the baton tightened as if it was his last lifeline, his last ounce of control. But Shaq wasn't giving him an inch. The crowd, once hesitant, was now fully engaged. Phones stayed locked on the unfolding drama, fingers hovered over record buttons, and murmurs of outrage turned into open defiance. Shaq's deep voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Got cameras in there?" He directed the question at the cashier, who had been standing frozen behind the counter, eyes darting between Brady and the growing crowd. The young man hesitated, licking his lips nervously. Then finally he nodded. Officer Daniels perked up. "Let's check it." Brady spun on him. "There's no need for that," he snapped. Shaq's lips curled into a smirk. "Scared?" Brady scoffed, rolling his eyes. "It's just a waste of time." But his voice lacked the same bite, the same confidence it had just moments ago. Daniels exchanged a glance with Shaq, then turned to the cashier. "Pull up the footage." The crowd pushed closer, whispering among themselves as the cashier hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen before finally pressing a few buttons. A small monitor flickered to life, and there it was. The video was crystal clear. Frank Dawson, the frail old veteran, walked into the store with slow, deliberate steps. He picked up a can of soup, reached into his pocket, and placed a few crumpled bills on the counter. The cashier took the money, handed Frank his change, and then Brady entered the store. His face was unreadable, but his posture was unmistakable, full of authority, full of entitlement. He exchanged a few words with the cashier, then grabbed Frank's wrist and dragged him outside. The video looped. Silence. Brady's face drained of color. Daniels swallowed hard. "Well," he said slowly, turning to his partner. "What now?" The crowd exploded. "I knew it. He was set up. This man was about to go to jail for nothing." Brady took a step back, hands curling into fists. This is out of context," he sputtered. "You don't see what happened before." "Before what?" Shaq interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "Before you walked in and dragged him out like a criminal?" Brady opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Daniels, still looking at the screen, muttered, "This isn't right." Brady whirled on him. "You gonna side with them now?" Daniels didn't flinch. "I'm siding with the truth." Shaq turned to Brady, arms crossed. His towering presence alone was enough to make Brady shift uncomfortably. "So what now, officer?" The sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. But for whom? Brady's nostrils flared as Shaq calmly pulled out his phone, his massive hands moving with precise, deliberate control. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Frank rubbed his sore wrists, his frail fingers shaking slightly. But his eyes were locked on Shaq like a man seeing a lifeline for the first time in years. Shaq didn't waste time. He pressed a button and held the phone to his ear. His deep voice remained steady, composed. "Hey, it's me. We've got a situation." Brady's laugh was short, forced. "What, you calling your lawyer? You think that scares me?" His bravado was starting to crack, but he was still gripping onto it like a drowning man holding a rope. Shaq didn't even look at him. He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "No," he said smoothly. "I'm calling your boss." Brady's smug expression twitched, his jaw tensed. Daniels took a small, instinctive step back. He wasn't sure why, but he knew. Something big was coming. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, maybe more. Some whispered, others simply recorded in silence, their phones locked on the confrontation. A woman near the front, her arms crossed tightly, muttered, "I don't think he realizes who he's messing with." Brady barked out a humorless chuckle. "You think some phone call's gonna save you?" His voice was louder now, but the confidence was fading. "I don't care who you call. This is nothing." Shaq lowered the phone from his ear, raising an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" He turned to the crowd, scanning the faces. "How many of you got that on video?" A ripple of movement. Hands shot up, at least 20 phones held high. Some people had been live streaming since the start. Others had recorded from the moment Frank was slammed against the cop car. The videos were already making their way to social media. The world was watching. Brady swallowed hard, eyes darting from face to face. Daniels glanced at his partner and exhaled. He knew this was spiraling out of control. Then a new sound filled the air. Sirens. The crowd turned, heads snapping in the direction of flashing blue and red lights speeding toward them. Brady flinched. Shaq smirked. "Looks like your boss just got the message." A sleek, unmarked police SUV screeched to a stop in front of them. The driver's door flew open. Out stepped Captain Reynolds. Brady's face drained of all color. His fingers twitched at his belt. Daniel straightened his posture, his eyes wide. "Oh, Tate." Captain Reynolds wasn't just some middle management cop. He was the kind of man who didn't tolerate messes. And right now, this was a disaster. Reynolds' gaze locked onto Brady like a predator. "Tell me," he said, voice like steel, "what the hell is going on here?" The crowd's chants grew louder, voices blending into a wave of frustration and anger. "Let him go! Let him go!" Brady tightened his grip on his baton, scanning the growing sea of people. His jaw clenched as his eyes darted from face to face. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Back off!" he barked, his voice strained, but still laced with arrogance. "Or you'll be arrested too." Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "That's your play? You threaten innocent people instead of admitting you're wrong?" Frank stood quietly beside him, rubbing his swollen wrists. His hands trembled slightly, whether from age, pain, or the weight of his past, no one could tell. "They do this all the time," he muttered under his breath. Shaq's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" Frank hesitated, glancing around as if debating whether to speak at all. His voice was quieter this time, but the words carried more weight. "I ain't the first," he said, "and I sure as hell won't be the last." Shaq's chest tightened. This wasn't just about Frank anymore. This was bigger than one man. His gaze locked onto Brady, his stance shifting ever so slightly. "How many?" Brady's smirk returned. "Not your business." Shaq took a slow step forward. The crowd hushed. The only sound was the distant wail of approaching sirens. "Oh, it is now," Shaq said, his voice like quiet thunder. Daniels shifted uncomfortably beside Brady. His fingers twitched as if he was resisting the urge to reach for his own radio. The sirens grew louder. A second police SUV screeched to a stop in front of the store. The passenger door flew open before the tires had fully settled. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the chaos around him. His expression was carved from stone. Captain Reynolds. Brady inhaled sharply, his bravado faltering for the first time. Daniels muttered under his breath, "Oh, shit." The crowd instinctively parted as Reynolds walked forward, his gaze locked on Brady. The weight of authority pressed down like a storm cloud ready to break. Shaq remained still, waiting. Brady straightened his back, trying to reclaim his composure, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Reynolds stopped just feet away from him. The silence stretched, The tension thickened. Finally, the captain spoke. His voice was steady, low, and ice cold. "Tell me," he growled, his glare drilling into Brady, "what the hell is going on here?" The power dynamic had shifted, but which way would it fall? The air was thick with tension as Captain Reynolds closed the distance between himself and off. Officer Brady. His heavy boots thudded against the pavement, each step radiating authority. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, locked onto Brady. What the hell is going on here? Brady straightened his back, trying to mask the panic flickering behind his eyes. "Nothing serious, sir," he said with forced confidence. "Just handling a shoplifter." Shaq let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. His arms crossed over his broad chest, his towering presence unshaken. "That's a lie," he said, voice calm but commanding. Reynolds turned toward Shaq, eyebrows furrowing. "Explain." Daniel stepped forward before Brady could. His voice was measured, but his hesitation was clear. "Sir, we have video proof that Mr. Dawson never stole anything. The cashier just admitted it was a mistake." The crowd murmured, phones still raised, recording every second. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, slow and deep. "Is that so?" Brady shifted his weight, hands clenching into fists. "Doesn't matter. He was acting suspicious and I—" "Stop talking," Reynolds snapped, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. Brady flinched. Shaq tilted his head, watching the interaction with interest. "See, Captain, the problem isn't just this one time," he said. "How many other innocent people has this guy done this to?" Frank, still rubbing his sore wrists, cleared his throat. "Happens more than you'd think," he muttered. Reynolds turned his glare back to Brady. "You got video proof against you, witnesses saying this is a pattern, and now a civilian who's been through hell because you can't do your damn job right." His voice was growing sharper, laced with disappointment. "You've embarrassed this department." Brady's face drained of color. "Sir, I was following—" Reynolds held up a hand. "No, Brady. You were abusing your badge, and I will not have this department dragged through the mud because you think you're above accountability." Brady's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched toward his belt. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Shaq took a slow step forward, voice dropping an octave. "You about to reach for something, officer?" Brady hesitated, then slowly moved his hand away. Reynolds took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing back on Brady. Then with a voice that left no room for argument, he said, "Hand over your badge." Brady's eyes darted between Shaq, the cameras, and Reynolds. His world was crumbling, and he knew it. The silence stretched for a long, heavy moment. The weight of Captain Reynolds' words pressed down on the entire scene. Brady's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching by his side. His pride was crumbling, and he knew it. "You can't be serious," he spat, his voice low and shaking with restrained anger. Reynolds took a slow step forward, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was stone cold, unreadable. "Do it now, or I'll do it for you," he repeated, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable finality. The crowd leaned in, their collective anticipation thick in the air. A few murmurs rippled through them, some were even whispering in excitement. Shaq remained still, towering over Brady like an immovable force. His dark eyes never left the disgraced officer, reading him like an open book. He knew Brady wasn't the type to back down quietly. Brady's fingers reached for his badge, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening. He wasn't just losing his authority, he was losing control, and that was something he had never experienced before. Frank Dawson, still rubbing his bruised wrists, watched with tired eyes. His shoulders sagged, exhausted but vindicated. Brady let out a slow breath before violently ripping the badge from his chest. He clutched it tightly in his fist for a second, knuckles turning white, before throwing it down at Reynolds' feet. The metal clattered against the pavement, the sound unnervingly final. "This is bullshit," he snarled. Reynolds didn't even flinch. He looked down at the discarded badge, then back at Brady. His expression didn't change. "No, Brady, this is justice," he said simply. A few people in the crowd started clapping, slow at first, then louder. The tension snapped as some onlookers cheered outright. Daniels, who had been holding his breath the entire time, finally exhaled, his shoulders dropping in relief. He knew working under Brady had been a ticking time bomb. Now that bomb had just detonated. Brady turned sharply, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. His gaze zeroed in on Shaq, his eyes burning with fury. "This is your fault," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at him. Shaq, who hadn't moved a muscle, let a slow, amused smirk cross his face. He tilted his head slightly, looking Brady up and down as if he were just another desperate man, scrambling to hold on to power he no longer had. Nah, Shaq said, voice steady and deep. This is karma. Brady's nostrils flared. Without another word, he turned and shoved past the crowd, his heavy boots stomping angrily against the pavement. People parted, but not out of respect. They moved like they were making way for trash to be taken out. A few boos erupted. Someone shouted, "Good riddance." Another voice called, "Bet you won't be bullying anyone else now." Brady didn't look back. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides, his entire body trembling with barely restrained fury. The moment he disappeared down the street, Reynolds bent down, scooped up the badge, and let out a tired sigh. "Goddamn mess," he muttered. Then his sharp eyes moved to Frank. "Mr. Dawson," Reynolds said, clearing his throat, "I deeply regret what happened tonight." Frank looked up, weary but dignified. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the man in charge, assessing whether this apology actually meant something. Shaq stepped forward. "Yeah, that's nice and all," he said, glancing at Reynolds. "But words ain't enough. What happens now?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. The real test was coming. What would the department do about Frank now? The crowd had started to disperse, but the weight of the moment still lingered in the air. The echoes of Brady's downfall hadn't fully faded when Shaq turned his attention back to Frank. The old man stood there, rubbing his sore wrists, staring down at the pavement as if it had the answers to a lifetime of struggle. Shaq took a deep breath and spoke in a tone that left no room for argument. "You got anywhere to stay tonight?" Frank hesitated, shuffling his feet. His hands twitched slightly as if debating whether to tell the truth or brush it off with a casual lie. I'll figure something out," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer. He had seen that kind of hesitation before, the kind where pride fought against desperation. He knew Frank was trying to save face, trying not to be a burden. "Nah," Shaq said, shaking his head. "That's not good enough." He took a step closer, his towering presence making Frank look even smaller. "You served this country. You sacrificed. You don't deserve to be figuring it out. You deserve better." Frank's eyes lifted, confusion flickering behind them. He searched Shaq's face, trying to find some kind of catch, some reason why a man like this would care. "What are you saying?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. The screen glowed in the dim light of the street lamp, illuminating his serious expression. He tapped a number and brought the phone to his ear. "Hey, it's me," Shaq said, pausing. "Yeah, I need a favor." Frank watched in stunned silence as Shaq carried out a conversation he couldn't quite hear. The words were short, clipped, but with purpose. Shaq wasn't asking for help. He was making things happen. A few seconds later, Shaq hung up and slid his phone back into his pocket. He looked at Frank with a grin that didn't quite match the intensity in his eyes. "Come on, old man," Shaq said, jerking his head toward the street. "We're going somewhere." Frank blinked. "Where?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the curb, where a sleek black SUV had pulled up. The tinted windows gleamed under the city lights. Frank frowned. "Wait, what's happening?" Shaq clapped a heavy hand on Frank's shoulder and gave him a gentle push toward the car. "You'll see." The door swung open, revealing a sharply dressed man in a suit holding out a set of keys. Shaq took them, twirling them around his finger before handing them to Frank. "Welcome home," Shaq said. Frank stared at the keys in disbelief, then at Shaq, then back at the keys. His hands trembled as he reached out and took them. "You? What?" Shaq grinned. "I just bought you an apartment." Frank's breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the keys. His voice cracked. This can't be real." The engine hummed softly as Shaq maneuvered the SUV through the dimly lit streets. Frank sat in the passenger seat, hands trembling as he clutched the keys Shaq had just given him. His breathing was shallow, his body rigid like he was afraid to believe this was real. For the first few minutes, silence filled the car, broken only by the occasional sniffle from Frank. He wiped his eyes discreetly, but Shaq noticed. "You good, Frank?" Shaq asked, his voice calm but firm. Frank exhaled shakily, looking down at the keys in his hand. I don't understand why you're doing this," he admitted. His voice was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. Shaq kept his eyes on the road, but his expression softened. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because you deserve better than what this city tried to do to you today." Frank shook his head. still struggling to process. I fought for this country. I gave everything I had. And look where I ended up. Shaq glanced at him before turning onto a quiet street lined with upscale apartment buildings. Yeah, well, he said, sometimes the world gets it wrong. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Frank let out a weak chuckle, but his eyes glistened. You sound like my old sergeant. Shaq smirked. Your sergeant must have been a smart man. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of a pristine, modern apartment complex. The exterior lights cast a warm glow, making the place look inviting. A leasing agent stood outside, clipboard in hand, waiting for them. Frank squinted at the building, then back at Shaq. What is this? Shaq turned off the car and unbuckled his seatbelt. Your new home. Frank's breath caught in his throat. His fingers clutched the seat like he might fall through it. No, I can't. This is too much. Shaq didn't argue. He just pushed open his door and stepped out, waiting for Frank to follow. After a long hesitation, Frank unbuckled and got out, his legs unsteady beneath him. The leasing agent greeted them with a smile. Mr. Dawson, welcome. We've got everything ready for you inside. Frank turned to Shaq, panic flickering in his eyes. I can't afford this, he whispered. Shaq patted his shoulder. Already taken care of. First year's rent is paid. Gives you time to get back on your feet. Frank's lips trembled, his body swaying slightly. I don't know what to say. Shaq handed him the keys, pressing them firmly into his palm. You don't have to say anything, Frank. Just go inside. Frank took a slow, shaky step toward the entrance. His fingers ran along the key, tracing its edges like he needed to convince himself it was real. He swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The apartment was simple but beautiful, fully furnished, clean, and warm. A fresh start. Frank walked in, his eyes darting around the space. He ran a hand over the couch, then the kitchen counter, like a blind man seeing for the first time. He turned to Shaq, chest rising and falling rapidly. His lips quivered. I don't deserve this. Shaq stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Frank's shoulder. Yes, you do. You've given enough, Frank. Let someone give back for once. Frank broke. A sob tore from his throat as he collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Years of struggle, pain, and neglect all came crashing down in that moment. Shaq let him have it. He stood by the door, arms crossed, waiting. After a long minute, Frank wiped his face, sniffling. He looked up at Shaq with gratitude and disbelief. I'll never forget this, he whispered. Shaq smiled, shaking his head. Then make sure the next guy gets help too. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Some were neighbors, some were just people who had followed the story. They watched as Shaq stepped out, leaving Frank to settle into his new home. As Shaq walked toward his car, he heard someone whisper behind him. That's a real hero. Shaq didn't turn around. He just smiled, got into his SUV, and drove off into the night. Because real change starts with one act of kindness and one person brave enough to make it happen.